Ladies and gentlemen,
네, 기빈 여러분, 이제 분임토의 제5 세션을 진행하도록 하겠습니다. 주제는 국제안보고요. 각 연자분께서는 7분에서 8분 정도의 시간을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 제임스 앤드루 루이스 미국 전략문제연구소 국장님께서 본 세션의 좌장을 맡아주시겠습니다. 자, 그러면 제임스 루이스 국장님을
Great. Thanks, and thanks to our Korean host for organizing such a successful event. We're going to run till 12:30 here. We'll see how that goes. We have a lot of speakers, and I know there's people in the audience who want to say things. What we're going to talk about is kind of following the group of government experts and how that's changed the landscape here, right? The GGE changed the political landscape for internet security. The endorsement of the UN Charter, the emphasis on international law and on state sovereignty, these are all important differences, a sharp break with the past approach. It's a good basis for cooperation, but I think you'll hear from our speakers there's a lot more work to do. GGE changed the political landscape. I think the Snowden revelations have changed the dynamics of the discussion, and that will probably come up. My guess is that overall it will slow the discussion. It may change a little bit, but we don't want to overestimate the effect. What we are seeing is a process underway where the discussion of cybersecurity is being embedded in a larger context of international relations. It's becoming a normal part of this, albeit one with some unusual characteristics, right? So the panelists will each speak as briefly as humanly possible, and we'll go over this. Let me tell you who they are. I'm just going to read their titles quickly. Lim Jong-in is the Dean of the Graduate School of Information Security at Korea University. Chris Painter is the Cyber Coordinator at the U.S. Department of State. Andrei Krutsky is the Ambassador at Large and the Special Coordinator for Political Affairs relating to ICTs in Russia. John Quinn is the Assistant Secretary for Strategic Issues and Intelligence Branch in Australia. Zhu Longdi is an Associate Research Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, which is affiliated with the Foreign Ministry, Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We also have two lead discussants, Audrey Planck, who is the Director for Cybersecurity and Internet Governance at Intel Corporation, and Ayal Danan, who is the Vice President and Director General for Signals Intelligence, Electronic Warfare, Cyber. Did I leave anything out? That'll do. At IAI and ELTA. And we have two private sector discussants up here because one of the breakthroughs in the GGE was an emphasis that the private sector should play an appropriate role in the further discussion of norms, and I think we'll do that. This panel is a little different. We're going to open with some remarks by Director Yang from the National Cybersecurity Center in Korea. We'll then go down the panelists as they appear in your agenda. So if I could ask Director Yang to, there you are. Are you going to come up? I think so. Please come up. Yeah.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, 안녕하십니까? Good morning. It is my honor to stand here and give a speech as the director of the National Cybersecurity Center of the Republic of Korea. Today, I would like to speak about the current cyber threat situation the Republic of Korea is in. The cybersecurity system of the Republic of Korea, and the necessity of international cooperation in the field of cybersecurity. During the last 10 years, the Republic of Korea has suffered from data hackings, where more than 1 million pieces of information were stolen, among which 300 were confidential. The Republic of Korea experienced 6 massive cyber attacks, where 160 organizations' networks were jeopardized, and more than 50,000 PCs and servers were destroyed. The Republic of Korea is a nation that is highly vulnerable to cyber attacks, where hundreds of cyber attacks are detected and blocked every day. Easy accessibility and autonomy of cyberspace due to the Republic of Korea's high-tech infrastructures can be one of the reasons for such attacks. But the biggest reason is the fact that it being the only divided state in the world where confrontation in the cyberspace is profound. As you are all aware, the North Korea is focusing on cyber war as its asymmetric power. They have already secured more than 1,000 hackers with 3,000 supporting manpower. And even at this very moment, they are planning and committing cyber attacks on this nation. They are committing cyber attacks on the media, finance, business, and the conservative organizations in every opportunities they have to cause chaos in the society of Republic of Korea. However, the Republic of Korea is doing its best and has established its own system to counteract against such cyber provocations. In order to protect the national critical information and communications infrastructures, the Republic of Korea has legislated the CIIP Act and set to manage 200 of national critical infrastructures. In 2004, the National Cybersecurity Center was established to detect and promptly counteract against any cyber attacks on the public and governmental organizations. The NCSC manages 30 cyber threat monitoring centers to monitor 7,000 public and governmental organizations on 24/7 basis. The NCSC has guided the public and governmental organizations to separate its intranet from the internet, physically or logically, and is managing the network of central administrative departments en bloc. In case of severe cyber instance, it is systemized to report to the presidential office to prompt countermeasures, and the private, public, and military joint response team is formed to block and investigate the incident, restore the victimized system, and track down the attacker. The NCSC is doing its best to defend against the cyber attacks at national level. But because the tactics and technologies of the hackers are advancing every day, it is a hard challenge for the NCSC to thoroughly defend its cyber frontier alone, especially because the cyber attacks are perpetrated by a number of nations to prevent, trace back the origin of attack, and prove its guilt alone. This again leads to the difficulty to bring international sanctions on the attackers or maintain deterrence on cyber threats. This is why the international cooperation is essential. It is vital to have cyber allies who can cooperate to promptly block the cyber attacks and provide any information related to the attacks. It is crucial to have a system where the international society participates in the investigation to trace back the malicious attacker when there is a request from the victimized nation. And we must strengthen the international cooperation to secure the deterrence on cyber attackers through international communities' condemnation and even sanctions if necessary. I hope that effective measures for securing deterrence against cyber threats can be intensively discussed during today's conference. The Republic of Korea seeks for the peace in the cyberspace. We will consistently strive for the international cooperation through trainings, exercises, and joint researches, and fully support our allies who ask for our offer of cyber threat countermeasure know-hows along with our experiences. I hope this Seoul Conference on Cyberspace 2013 will do much toward building the basis for the international cooperation. I hope you make beautiful memories during your stays in the Republic of Korea, and wish you all the best. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you, Director Yang. Korea is, of course, I'd say one of the flashpoints in cyberspace, so we appreciate your taking the time to make those remarks. What we'll do now is go through the list of speakers as they appear in your agenda. Professor Lim, please. Thank you.
Thank you, moderator. Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am Jong-in Lim from Korea University. I'm Dean of School of Information Security. It's an honor to be a speaker of this panel. Before going to main presentation, let me introduce summary report of pre-workshop on international security. There was a pre-workshop on international security June 28th this year. This was hosted by Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and venue was Korean National Diplomatic Academy, not far from here. Guest was 100 more experts from various countries, including Korea, United States, China, Australia. There was in-depth discussion about various topics, especially main themes of the pre-workshop was follows: trust and transparency among states in cyberspace. As we know, trust and transparency is the most important critical infrastructure in information society. So, what are the practical measures to enhance competence and transparency in cyberspace? Also, there are growing concerns about cyber conflict between countries, and there is no existing international law to apply. So, how does existing international law address attacks on critical infrastructure, especially to banking, energy, transportation, and water? Also, international de-escalation and resolution framework. There are no practical framework for handling cyber conflict. So, what type of framework can be developed at regional and international level to handling de-escalation and resolution? Also, competence building measures are sought. Can some competence building measure can be developed and applied to international security issue in cyberspace? All participants agreed that cyberspace should not be utilized as a space to create conflict among states. It is often said cyberspace is a new domain of warfare, but cyberspace should not be utilized as a space, as a conflict among states. Enhancing international cooperation is vital. Every state must build competence and peace in cyberspace. So, state responsibility is important. Every state must implement practical measures to reduce the risk of conflict and build competence. Now, get down to the main presentation. My presentation title is Lessons from Recent Cyber Attack Against South Korea. Think globally, act locally, and cooperate internationally for global cyber peace. As Director Yang said, South Korea has suffered severe cyber attack for the last 10 years from overseas, especially from North Korea. Let me give some examples. In 2009, July 7th, there was a huge DDoS attack against several government sites and private sites. Also, 2 years later, also DDoS attack. And in that year, 2011, Nongyeop Bank, one of the biggest banks in Korea, was attacked by APT attack. So, banking service was faltered several days. Also, this year, March 20th, there was a huge attack, APT attack, to Korean national TV station and Sinan Bank, one of the leading banks in South Korea. There was a huge economic loss and social chaos between Korean people. Also, 3 months later, there was an attack from North Korea to government site, especially including Cheongwade, Korea White House. Huge attack. There is details in the box. So, Korean government published a national comprehensive cyber security countermeasure to raise cyber capability. Some of them, let me cite some of them. It is very important cybersecurity workforce. So, foster 5,000 cybersecurity experts by 2017. Also, make it clear cybersecurity governance. Unified and speedy response is very important. So, government made it clear, appoint Cheongwade, Korea White House as a control tower, and NIS, Korea NSA, as a handler of working level affairs. Also, double the size of security market and expand critical infrastructure protection object, and private and public sector information sharing system was established. Why repeated cyber attack against South Korea? Why cannot block them? Let me explain some characteristics of South Korea. South Korea is, as you know, one of the most wild countries in the world. Also divided country in armistice situation for more than 60 years, and military confrontation with North Korea, and tension is growing. North Korea is one of the most powerful countries in military cyber warfare. Therefore, South Korea is a very lucrative target of cyber attack. Also, this year's cyber attack has some characteristics. As I said, this year's cyber attack was targeted toward broadcasting, bank, and critical infrastructure. So these attacks cause serious economic loss, social chaos, and national insecurity. It is assumed North Korea is behind the curtain of this cyber attack, and this assumption is proved through investigation. Many experts agreed that this year's attack is a use of force, but some difference whether it is an armed attack. But if it is an armed attack, we can invoke the right of self-defense by the UN Charter. But when can a right to self-defense can be invoked? and how can we counterattack for self-defense? What's the proportionate and necessary means of counterattack? Also, how can we determine which nation is backing a cyber attack? North Korea is suspected, but it is very difficult. As Director Yang said, attribution problem is very difficult. If attacking country, as North Korea always do, deny involvement, what can we do? Other questions? Anonymous Korea, South Korea branch of hacking hacktivist group Anonymous said they will retaliate against North Korea. Most people applaud and supported them, but how can you interpret Anonymous Korea's activity? If North Korea launched preemptive cyber attack against South Korea, how can you handle it? What is state responsibility for cyber attack? In many cases, state's national cyber response is incomplete and limited due to technical difficulty and jurisdiction problem. It took much time for the state to finish an investigation. In this year's case, it took about 2 weeks to investigate and concluded that it is an attack by North Korea. But openly, it is very difficult to find conclusive and sufficient evidence in a timely manner. So, the right of self-defense is very difficult to exert. What for? Global characteristics of cyberspace and cyber attack is because of lack of one state's national cyberspace response effort, but because of inherent limitation of nationwide response in globalized networks environment. Cyberspace is a global space, and cybersecurity is a global issue. Also, ambiguity and overlapping of cyber-related concepts. There is no common definition among cyber war, cyber terror, cyber crime, cyber weapon, and security. Also, no criteria for evaluating damage from cyber attack. Attribution problem is very difficult because of anonymity in internet. Also, jurisdiction issue. Also, no universally valid global cyber norm for peacetime and wartime. No globally agreed interpretation of existing international law, such as UN Charter, law of armed attack. No authorized international cybersecurity organization, trusted verifying agency like IAEA in nuclear case. What is the solution for these problems and questions? Some progress. There are many international efforts in the field of international cyber norm, such as UN GGE report. Group of governmental experts this year, June 10th, published the precious achievement of international cybersecurity consensus. They consist of 15 nations, including United States, China, and Russia. Also, this year, there is Tallinn Manual as a significant guideline of applying international law to cyber conflict. Are these efforts sufficient? No. There is a limitation and problems. Let me analyze Tallinn Manual more precisely.
Professor Lim, could you maybe compress your concluding remarks?
Okay.
That would be great.
Tallinn Manual is not official document. It's an only academic result. Also, it is not ideal, not impeccable.
Yes, that's a good way to put it.
As a conclusion, I want to emphasize requirement for global cyberspace and deterrence. Globally agreed cyber norm and rules must be developed. Also, we must check models such as Cyber IAEA or Global Information Center, globally authorized cyber organization. also develop and research global-scale cybersecurity technology. Also, lesson from cyber attack against South Korea, I propose think globally. We live in globalized world. Think collateral damage. Also act locally. Every state must do its best to be secure their nation's cyberspace and think of state responsibility and cooperate and collaborate internationally. My last words, let's share advanced and creative ideas for international cybersecurity and global cyber peace. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Lim, and I hope your slides will be made available to the audience after the discussion, given the valuable points they had in them. We'll now ask Chris Painter if he could.
Thanks, Jim, and I'd like to appreciate or express my appreciation for our Korean hosts in putting on what I think has been a really valuable conference today. And I appreciate being here again. I was in this panel discussion in Budapest last year, and I think this really has been a landmark year in a lot of ways for this topic, and I'll hit on that. I'm going to talk today about some of the steps the U.S. has taken working with the rest of the world community to more effectively address the kinds of international security challenges that Professor Lim has described. The U.S. regards cyberspace as something that is neither owned nor controlled by states alone. We see states as one of the many stewards working to ensure that this resource is available to all of the world's people. Yet in the cyber realm, as elsewhere, states have a special responsibility both to protect their own national security and to promote peaceful and stable relations between themselves and other states and other nations. Because state-on-state actions in cyberspace have the potential to disrupt cyber-dependent economies and damage critical national infrastructure, it is essential that states promote transnational cooperation in order to keep peace in cyberspace and really pursue some of those creative ideas that Professor Lim just talked about. For some time, the U.S. has been promoting this concept of international cyber stability. Basically, that's an environment in which all states are able to benefit from cyberspace, in which cooperation is encouraged, in which there is little incentive for states to disrupt or to attack one another. We believe that the best way to achieve that kind of stability is through the adoption by all states of long-standing international norms to guide state behavior, supported, importantly, by practical cooperative activities designed to reduce risk and promote confidence, or what we call confidence-building measures. Since 2009, you heard reference to this by Jim and also by our last speaker, in the context of the UN group of government experts on cyber issues, my country, working with others, has promoted the affirmation by all states of the applicability of international law. Indeed, at the very first conference, the London conference, our Vice President Biden, made this statement at the conference live by video from Washington, D.C. And that includes international humanitarian law, the applicability of international humanitarian law to cyberspace, and the adoption of a wide range of confidence-building measures to encourage transnational cooperation. We have also stressed the need for more developed states to help build the capacity of less developed states in the area of national cybersecurity, and some of those topics were touched on one of the panels yesterday. We were therefore really exceptionally pleased, and this is why this has been such a landmark year, that this year in the 2013 GGE, under the really able stewardship of our Australian colleagues here on the panel today, that the GGE members were able to agree unanimously to a consensus report on cyber issues that, among other things, affirms some of these basic principles. And I urge you, if you haven't looked at this report, you should look at this report because there's so much good information and so many important findings in it. But some of the key ones from my perspective are international law, in particular the Charter of the United Nations, is applicable and essential to maintaining peace and stability and promoting an open, secure, peaceful, and accessible ICT environment. That's a really incredibly important finding, that existing international law applies. Second, that state efforts to address the security of ICTs must go hand in hand with respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms set forth in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in other international instruments. Third, that states must meet their international obligations regarding internationally wrongful acts attributable to them. States must not seek to use proxies to commit internationally wrongful acts. States should seek to ensure that their territories are not used by non-state actors for unlawful use of ICTs. Again, all of these are really critical findings, and I think are the foundation for discussions to come. As I said, there are many other important things that are worth reading in that report, but that GGE report also underscores the other aspect that I mentioned at the top, the fact that cyber confidence building measures can reduce the risk of conflict by increasing predictability and reducing misperception in cyberspace, something that is all too real a problem given how cyberspace operates. The experts of the GGE affirm that CBMs can make an important contribution, I'm quoting, quote, make an important contribution to addressing the concerns of states over the use of ICTs by states and be a significant step toward greater international security. The report outlines a number of these confidence-building measures. I will list just a couple, but again, it's worth looking at these. One is the creation of bilateral, regional, and multilateral frameworks for confidence building. One is exchanges of information using computer emergency response teams, existing emergency response teams. Another is increased cooperation to address incidents, ICT incidents, really cooperating together, and enhance law enforcement cooperation mechanisms. But there are many different formulas for confidence building measures. The goal is to increase transparency, build confidence, and that could be both as transparency measures and then building on top of that cooperative measures against threats, and then finally the kind of stability measures that achieves the stability, the international cyber stability that we seek. The United States is a firm believer in the importance of these practical confidence building measures, and we and my colleague to the left of me have put these words into action. We have, in February of 2011, the United States proposed to the Russian Federation that confidence-building measures, which have been effective in other areas, could help prevent bilateral misunderstandings in cyberspace. And importantly, on June 18th of this year, President Obama and President Putin announced the entry into force of the first ever cyber confidence-building measures, another landmark event that happened this year since the discussion of this issue last year. And these measures are designed to ensure that adequate lines of communication exist in the event that cyber incidents of national security concern arise. I'll give you some of the basis of this. Our nations will exchange technical information about malware or malicious indicators which appear to originate from each other's territory. That will help protect our critical networks. We will use the existing, what's called the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center, which of course was designed for the nuclear age, but has been applied to other contexts like climate change and other areas as well. This will allow us to quickly and reliably make inquiries to reduce the possibility of misperception and escalation from ICT security events. And the White House and the Kremlin will establish a direct, secure voice between the U.S. Cybersecurity Coordinator and the Russian Deputy Secretary of the Security Council, should there be a need to directly manage a crisis that arises from an ICT incident. We also exchanged white papers on some of our military doctrine some time ago, and all of these, I think, have been important as an example to the rest of the world. And indeed, the U.S. has made analogous proposals multilaterally, both in the Organization for Cooperation in Europe and in the organization, or the ARF here in the Asia region. And those proposals have been taken up unanimously in both of those forums. We've also tried to engage other states in bilateral dialogues, including China. The U.S. and China have just created a working group on cyber issues to discuss many of these same issues. I will conclude by noting that international security and measures to promote it, like the ones I've described, are not important just to those states, those 15 countries, including the U.S., Russia, China, Australia, who are part of the GGE, but to every state in this room, and every state has been part of this conference. Every state has a stake in the peaceful in a peaceful cyberspace, because every state wants its citizens to benefit from all the good things that cyberspace can provide, which we've heard about at this conference, and nations which are willing to work, nations which are still working to address the challenges of domestic cyber policy and cyber strategies may initially feel unprepared to engage in this issue because it's a complex and advanced issue on international cyber stability. But that's why it's so important that we and other nations stand up ready to help with capacity building efforts. Capacity building, in fact, is one of the most effective ways nations can work cooperatively together to build trust for a more peaceful and stable cyberspace. And indeed, capacity building also finds voice in the group of government experts report. And finally, as Jim mentioned at the top, there are other stakeholders who are involved too, including the private sector in appropriate ways. And so all of these things, I think, build a real foundation for going forward. And I will say that there was a lot of activity last year that really, I think, is a landmark in nature and that really builds the foundation for great discussions over the next couple of years and further progress.
Thanks, Chris. Ambassador Stokes, the Australian ambassador, Deborah Stokes, really did a fabulous job in the 2013 GGE, but she built on the successful work of the 2010 GGE, which was led by our next speaker, Ambassador Andrei Krutsky of Russia.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, first of all, I wish to express my appreciation to the organizers of the conference for this opportunity to discuss really, truly global issues of the highest importance and priority. I'd like to present my ideas today in the form of self-interrogation, if interrogation is the right English word for the situation. I will be asking myself questions and try to provide answers if I can. I choose this method because it proved to be effective during the London stage of the conference in November 2011, though many questions, very keen questions, were asked and were left unanswered. Today, I'm going to slightly modify one of the questions which I consider and my country considers very vital. What shall we all do if the cyber attack which happened to Iran, to some other countries, will be repeated against any of our states today? Is the world community ready to jointly resist such a threat, to prevent it, to identify an attacker, and to punish him? I am an eyewitness of an attack on the Republic of Korea which happened last March. I was heading the Russian delegation here, interagency delegation for intergovernmental first Russian-Korean consultations on cybersecurity. The attack from abroad was directed against critical infrastructure, against financial institutions, against local press. Definitely, it is deplorable. In our mind, the world community cannot stand it any longer. We cannot be in a position that we are all hostages of such attacks and only waiting for our turn to become the victims. After the London conference, some countries proposed their own recipes on how to deal with such situations. I'm not trying to blame anyone, no accusations raised, but just recently, I'm only raising doubts for you to judge for yourselves whether unilateral actions could help solve global issues. So in this content, I'm attracting your attention to the British Defense Minister announcement a few weeks ago that his country's desire to build up its offensive cyber potential. I'll be mentioning the United States also because it's already created such a potential and announced earlier that they would repel a cyber attack on them by all means available, including military ones. Though quite delicately, there was no clarification whether the nukes would be used for these purposes. Chris, I'm saying all that not to annoy you and not to provoke discussions. Maybe everything is justified. And later on, you'll see that we'll have much more in common. You referred to this. But I'm only saying it for the purpose that, of course, other countries, when they will see these unilateral actions, they will not turn their backs on it, and they will start taking measures of precaution. And now We're having, according to public information, more than 130 countries experimenting in the field of cyber warfare, at least in the format of exercises. We can call it an arms race. Do we need it? Arms race never led to stable situation. So if the development of offensive cyber potential should be the example to all of us to follow, then what is this conference all about? I think, and this is my personal deep conviction, that the positive feature, the significance of the London process and the achievement of this particular conference is that the world community is practically united by preferring to have peaceful means of solving issues related to the use of ICTs, and not building up offensive cyber muscles. Is this perspective realistic? My answer is yes. As a positive example, based on the desire to come to terms and mutual understanding that cyber incidents could be leading to grave consequences, I would make reference, as it was done by the State Secretary earlier at this conference, by the head of my delegation and by Chris, about the agreements on confidence-building measures between Russia and the USA. Maybe I'll add a few more positive details about them. The package consists of 3 intergovernmental agreements in the form of diplomatic notes and a presidential statement. Nothing big or ambiguous, but very timely and important. Both presidents called these agreements unprecedented. I'm a passionate kind of guy, and proceeding from this passion, I would say that, in my opinion, the explanation for this unprecedented nature is that I would call these agreements as third millennium non-aggression pact in the cyberspace. Though they might look very technical to a reader, these documents provide a mechanism for rapid and diversified exchange of information, including that at a political level. This is vital for effective annihilation of suspicions and prevention of cyber incidents between our 2 countries. It is planned that the first meeting of Russian-American high-level working group set up by the presidents to take this ball will take place in coming November. Its task is not only to further specify the parameters of these agreements, but also to look for new possibilities of our bilateral cooperation in cyberspace. Am I happy with what has been achieved so far with Americans in the field of information security? As a negotiator, yes, but in a broader perspective, not exactly. Why? Because these agreements include only 2 of us and solve some issues only in bilateral format, and more so because they are far away from practical cooperation on elimination of cyber threats as they are. If we all choose bilateral track to build up global cybersecurity, we would need hundreds of such agreements to a safety net. Is there something more effective? I can recall the Shanghai Organization States Intergovernmental Agreement on Cooperation in the sphere of information security in 2009. It is non-ideological, pragmatic, and practical, and it goes much further than just an exchange of information. It helps member states to jointly overcome the damage and other negative consequences of cyber attacks. What it does not provide is building up offensive cyber potential. It is an open agreement for other countries to join. Am I happy now? As a negotiator of this agreement, yes. But in a broader perspective, I still have some doubts. Because it is only a regional agreement, though it covers the cyberspace in which more than 1.5 billion people live on 1/4 part of the globe. In our opinion, the truly effective information security is achievable and would be in the interests of every user and business when it is only global and universal. Only then we can guarantee that there would be no safe havens for those who would wish to use ICTs for malicious purposes. Such a universal agreement could be a useful legal instrument to solve some extra important cyberspace problems, as for example, the use of proxies and third countries for cyber attacks and aggression. A realpolitik approach proceeds from an attitude that a great goal could be achieved by little yet significant steps. The mentioned Shanghai Organization initiative, which was tabled in the UN in the form of a draft General Assembly resolution as a food for thought on rules of responsible behavior of states in cyberspace, goes along these lines. We also favor and actively participate in elaborations of confidence-building measures in the use of ICTs within the OSCE process. We hope that under the US chairmanship, which we supported from the very beginning and quite actively, we would shortly and successfully finish the work there. Half of the document is already agreed, if I'm not disclosing diplomatic secrets, and we think that this year the entire work would be finished and the initial list of CBMs be prepared, which might be useful for other regions as well. One more example, which was referred to many times during our conference, is the achievement in promoting cybersecurity, is the work of the UNGGA on information security. Debates were sometimes tough and lasted until very last moment, but it proved some important points. ICTs, as probably nothing before, put the world community in one boat. In front of common threats, we have and we can come to terms. The main value of the GGE report, which was adopted by consensus, is that its recommendations provide for cooperation in building up information cybersecurity. As a follow-up to this report and using its agreed language, Russia prepared this year a renewed draft resolution for the United Nations General Assembly on information security. Its main purpose is to continue the process of finding common understandings and solutions in the field under the auspice of the most representative international organization. We propose to call a new GGE in 2014 to expand its study mandate to such practical and concrete issues as the use of ICTs in conflicts and applicability of international law to the use of ICTs. So I hope that our common goal, as it was proved during this conference, and as it is reflected in the GGE report, is to concentrate our joint efforts on prevention of confrontation and conflicts in the cyberspace, but not their legitimization and provocation of arms race in the new technological era. And last but not least, I'm making use of this opportunity and want to express my personal appreciation to Australian diplomacy and personally to Ambassador Deborah Stokes, the chair of the UNGGE. The success of the group in a great deal was promoted by her professionalism, responsibility, objectivity, and dedication, and she makes me jealous of her. Thank you.
I worked for both Stokes and Krutsky, and I'm not sure which was the tougher boss. It was definitely a run-up, but gave Andre a little extra time because he has been crucial to this process really since the late 1990s. So,
during my chairmanship, you had more coffee breaks.
It's true. With that, let me ask John Quinn if he could make some remarks.
Thank you, Jim, and good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to have been invited to speak at this very distinguished panel on this very complex subject. And let me also join others in thanking the Korean organizers for such a spectacular event. I will pass on the kind comments made by Andre and others about the role that Australia played in the UNGGE process. Deborah Stokes was not able to be with us today. She's our ambassador in Port Moresby, a very important country for Australia, and was not able to extract herself. But I will pass on those kind thoughts, and let me say the cooperation of experts on that group was deeply appreciated by Australia, and we appreciate that this was a challenging topic and concessions were made. And I think, as Jim has mentioned, this report, I think, has really changed the landscape in our consideration of this complex subject. I guess just to make an obvious point, this issue is now a mainstream international security and political issue. So I think it behoves all of us, certainly those of us in the diplomacy realm, to try to get our minds around the challenges involved. There's clearly justified international concern about the threat posed by malicious activity in cyberspace by state and non-state actors, which is increasingly apparent over recent years. And of course, the blurring between criminal and other activity complicates our task particularly. Governments are very focused on protecting their networks, not just in terms of defence and national security, but critical infrastructure has been flagged this morning, which of course is reliant on internet-based control systems. Clearly also the economic damage to our societies is critical, but the social consequences, of course, of paralysis of the internet are also very profound. This connectivity that we all enjoy through the internet is also prejudiced by these threats. So the defence and national security folks have to look at these issues in a much broader context, and that obviously is a complication, but I think something we shouldn't overlook. The other challenge, of course, is all of us are at different stages of our thinking about these issues, and I think as Chris has mentioned, all of us, I think, need to get our minds around the issue and ask simple questions politely, as I was saying to some colleagues yesterday. I mean, these are issues we need to think about from our respective perspectives as a mainstream question. There are a range of perspectives that we need to understand, and I think this London process has been a very useful forum for us to listen and learn, as well as to talk to people with our own points of view. But I guess the bottom line for Australia is this infrastructure is critical to all of us. This is something that we all depend upon, and that should be the basis of our conversation about the international security dimensions of the challenge. As I mentioned before, the rising levels of anxiety about security, cybersecurity, are justified, but I think our concern is that we need to tackle these issues in a sort of measured, constructive and practical way and look at what we can do now in a practical sense to deal with the problems. I think also we do need to have some greater conceptual clarity and more precision in the use of terminology, because we, I think, get ourselves into some tangles because of the conflation of different issues, and I think to tease out the different strands of the cyber debate is helpful, and then I think sort of reconnect them, if that makes sense. Clearly also, this issue is amenable traditional statecraft. It's a vector of traditional rivalry between states, and I think we should look at the issue through that prism. There are strong agendas in play here, strong ideological agendas, philosophical agendas, social, cultural agendas. I think we should acknowledge those difficulties up front. We can't put those issues under the carpet. This is the reality of the conversation we're having. But as we all know, diplomacy and other strategies have been used over the years to address these questions, and I think this is not beyond human endeavour to try and find some practical ways forward and to avoid costly mistakes and miscalculations. In that context, again, in a real politics sense, we all know that major power relationships are critical, certainly in our Asia-Pacific region for Australia. So we very much welcome the initiatives that are referred to by Andre and Chris between the United States and Russia, of course, and the United States and China to really come together to develop some transparency and confidence-building measures. I think middle powers, smaller countries, we need to look at what those major powers are doing and see how we can replicate some of those very effective strategies. I'd also say I think that cyber does engage reputational issues, not just for companies, of course, but for governments. Bad behaviour in cyber causes consequences for all of us, and I think there are some soft norms developing in terms of what is acceptable and what's not acceptable behaviour in the cyber environment. And governments, companies, organisations value their reputation, and if your reputation is damaged by poor cyber behaviour, I think that's an important consideration we shouldn't dismiss. I won't repeat earlier speakers' comments about the novel aspects of cyber, but I think we do need to think about those. As I say, we need to apply a traditional statecraft approach, work out really what lessons we can learn from those experiences, but also think about the novel aspects which have been mentioned previously, the inherent international character of cyber, the dynamism of the technology, new applications come out every day, the challenge of attribution, it's hard to see who's doing what, the speed of the internet requiring very rapid responses. So there are some elements that clearly are a concern. The risks involved in cyber action, which can cause collateral damage, I think, as has been mentioned, unintended consequences. So I think putting those issues on the table is very important, but I think then we go back to our experience in different environments, counter-terrorism, arms control, bilateral relationships. What are the lessons we can learn from that traditional toolkit? And I guess from the Australian perspective, our assumption is we'll emerge with a bit of a hybrid approach. We'll be picking the tools from the different elements of the toolkit to address the cyber issues in a sort of practical way. Now, clearly, as has been discussed, the rules of the road issues very much on the table. Views differ on where we should go from here. I think it will take some time for the international consensus to emerge on the refinement of those rules, but I think the first important step has been taken in the GGE report. I think, as Jim Lewis mentioned, the landscape's been changed by this really very important document that does underline that international law, including the UN Charter, applies to states' use of cyberspace. A key conclusion and a very important one. Next step, obviously, is to look at how international law should apply in cyberspace, and certainly we're supportive of another UN GGE process and very keen to be engaged in that exercise. This will be challenging, particularly the application of international law to scenarios falling below the level of armed conflict. These are really quite difficult issues we're wrestling with at the moment. We're very committed to stay engaged in that process, and we encourage others to step forward as well. But we can't wait, I think, for those issues to be resolved. We have to do things now. We have to take some practical action, and that's, I think, where the transparency and confidence building measures agenda comes in so strongly. I think there are things we can all do unilaterally. Our governments can basically give people a clear view of what our doctrine and approaches are on cyber issues, including in the defence and security realm. I mean, one simple thing we can all do is basically announce that we're committed to the application of international law to cyberspace. This is a really fundamental first step, and we recognise the importance of this step in the GGE report. Such declarations, I think, will help promote understanding, including of differences, also help establish the costs of inappropriate action, encourage predictability, avoid destabilising surprises, and all of these things will help build trust. We can do these things today, and the Australian government has done this already. Given the proliferation of cyber actors in cyberspace, the ambiguity and the blurring of players, I think the potential for friction and potentially serious conflict is serious. So I think we need to focus on the areas of highest risk in the first instance. At the national level, again, we can do things unilaterally. We need to get our own domestic cyber houses in order. Creating strong cyber defences clearly delivers a strong deterrence message, which I think is very important. We give this particular issue high priority in Australia. Other measures at the national level on the transparency side include explaining our organisational structures and doctrines, particularly through things like defence white papers, providing information on domestic security policies and arrangements, cyber response and management arrangements, and crisis management arrangements. Now, of course, we have to do these things anyway because of the multi-stakeholder nature of the internet. So this is sort of core business, I think, for all governments. At the international level, we have long experience on confidence-building measures and taking them forward. They are important in terms of preventing escalation, which can lead to armed conflict. But importantly, they don't seek to achieve agreement. They're not a panacea, but they will clarify differences, they'll help focus on shared interests, and they'll avoid surprises. Again, very pleased to see the GGE report giving ringing endorsement to the importance of CBMs. Again, the importance of avoiding escalation to conflict is particularly critical. Our first step in this TCM debate is, of course, an awareness-raising conversation which we're having today, and I hope that all delegates will take these conversations home and generate conversations with their other agencies, with their business communities, and with civil society. Of course, it's important to identify TCBMs, elaborate them and agree them between states, but also practice them, exercise them, very important. Now, in the regional context, again, there's long experience of TCBMs. I'm delighted to hear that the OCSCE work is progressing apace in our own region, in the ASEAN Regional Forum. This is a particular focus of Australian endeavour, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. It's really important, I think, that we give those particular activities a higher profile in our regional bodies. So I'm very pleased to hear that the European community and the OSCE and those engaged in that process are pushing that forward, and we're very keen to take that forward in the ARF context. What are the good models? Where's the best practice? Again, very pleased to hear comment by our US and American colleagues about the value of their strategies. How can we replicate those strategies in our own relationships? How can we transpose those to regional and global context? I think we can learn a lot from the very practical, very specific hotlines, other endeavours that those agreements enshrine. I guess at the national level too, there are some challenges for all our governments and for all our societies. One important element is to integrate technical and policy people. How do we actually have structures in our governments where we can connect those dots? How do we develop our technical capability to identify, manage and respond to cyber incidents? What are the policy apparatuses we need to establish to come to grips quickly with these problems? These are all challenges, I think, that officials are wrestling with in many agencies in our governments. And as I say, particularly important how we change our mindsets. This is not an issue for technicians, this is an issue that all of us have to have a view on and contribute on. And of course we need to engage our business community and civil society in these issues. If you take critical infrastructure, in many of our countries this is owned by the private sector, so a conversation about protection of that infrastructure is really not very realistic without those people at the table. So as I say, a lot of work to be done. At the international level, I think stronger regional and global networks are important. This London process, I think, is strengthening those networks. We need to really look at how we can build points of contact at a policy level so that we can talk to each other if problems arise and deal with issues in a practical problem-solving way, not in a judgmental, accusatory fashion. Okay. Lines of communication are going to be very, very important, as I've mentioned before, given the distinctive challenges of cyberspace. Now, in our own region, we're very focused on the ASEAN Regional Forum. We're honoured to work closely with Russia and Malaysia on a cyber work plan in the ARF. We're co-chairing a workshop with Malaysia in early 2014 on these issues. So we're really very keen to learn from other regions and have, I think, a practical, common sense approach to taking action now on these issues, because we can't really afford to wait. I should also say that we're delighted with the work done by AP CERT in our region. This Asia-Pacific Computer Emergency Response process solves problems daily. There was a very nice vignette in the workshop I was honoured to attend in June before this event, where the Japan, Korean and China CERTs, we were told that they have a very close collaboration on a daily basis. Now this is a very, very important process that will avoid conflict, will manage conflict, will alert people to problems, and I understand it's working very, very effectively at that technical level. But we need to replicate that at a higher policy level and make sure that we connect the dots. So, Jim, in concluding, I'd just like to say that we can take action now. We have to do things now. All our governments, our business communities, our civil society. The TCBM agenda is well worn. We know what we need to be doing. There'll be challenges and problems, but at the same time, I think we need to be engaging in this longer-term challenge of norm elaboration. This is a very important process. We need to be listening, learning, negotiating, but we're in it for the long haul, but we're also concerned that we make sure we take action now. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, John. Some interesting points, and I hope we still have time at the end for some discussion with the audience, but John mentioned, areas of higher risk. It might be interesting to talk about what these are. I think all of the panelists mentioned, additional norms are needed. It'd be interesting to say what those are. These are questions you might want to think about. Professor Lim raised the actions of North Korea, which are reprehensible. We might want to talk about how international cooperation could help manage them. And finally, it might be interesting, when we get to our two discussants, it might be interesting to talk about what is the relationship between international security and internet governance. So these are all issues. We probably won't have time to talk about them, but at least you can think about them when we leave. With that, let me ask our final speaker, Zhu Rongdi, to make his remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I'd like to present some brief comments and evaluation on the third UN-GGE work. After 2 years of hard work, the third GGE made much progress in seeking consensus among the UN member states. produced a very comprehensive report with detailed recommendations, demonstrating that the international community is being pragmatic on this issue, and its understanding about the ICTs is going deeper, being good news for all. Specifically, the progress include identifying the threats, risks, and vulnerabilities in cyberspace, setting and seeking common goals for building a peaceful, secure, open, and cooperative ICT environment, and acknowledging the leading role of the states in addressing cyber threats, as well as the leading role of the UN in promoting dialogue among member states. The GGE also noted document A/66/359 circulated by the Secretary General at the request of the permanent representatives of China, the Russian Federation, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, containing a draft international code of conduct for information security. The GGE also acknowledged that international law, and in particular, the UN Charter, is applicable and is essential in maintaining peace and stability and promoting an open, secure, peaceful, and accessible ICT environment. The recommendations cover such a wide array as, first, norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior by states. Second, voluntary confidence-building measures and the exchange of information. And third, capacity-building measures. Although we could not expect a GGE to solve all questions with one stroke overnight, all of this progress is welcome, and further GGEs are expected to continue and enhance its work in the future. Second, I'd like to propose some suggestions on future GGE work. First, future GGEs could enhance their work on cybersecurity principles and concepts. For example, clarifying the concept of cyber sovereignty, which also have implications for states' rights and obligations in cyberspace. While talking about states' responsibilities in cyberspace, we should not forget the rights they should enjoy. Besides the general principles on cybersecurity, concrete norms and rules on the sub-level are also needed, such as those focusing on cybercrimes and the use of ICTs for military purposes. Second, more efforts should be devoted to seeking convergence and building consensus on a peaceful, secure, open, and cooperative cyberspace. Third, to tackle flourishing cyber threats, more legal, political, technical efforts and measures through international, regional, and bilateral cooperation are needed, in which the GGE could play a leading and facilitating role. The second part of my speech, for the sake of international security in cyberspace, I'd like to introduce a way for international cooperation, which I would call it a multi-model for global internet governance. Both theoretically and taking into account the realities on the ground, a multi-model will be a suitable form for global internet governance in the future, which will be conducive to enhancing international cooperation and preventing interstate conflicts in cyberspace. A multi-model means multi-actor, multi-level, and multi-dimension. Multi-actor implies that there are different kinds of players, actors, and participants in cyberspace with different roles in safeguarding cybersecurity and maintaining cyber hygiene. They include individuals, entities and groups, and states and international organizations, or simply state and non-state actors. All of these actors should play their dual roles, both individually and collectively, in cyberspace. If not, no one in essence could help. For example, individuals have to constantly update and make patches to their own computers to defend them from malicious activities. If one does not do this, nobody can help him. Of course, these different actors might also play different roles in different countries as a result of different historical and cultural backgrounds. Though the phrase of multi-actor is slightly different from the multi-stakeholder approach advocated by some countries. They share some commonalities in mobilizing, encouraging, and motivating all participants in cyberspace to bring their own dual roles into full play. Second, multi-level. Multi-level indicates that to effectively maintain cybersecurity and tackle cyber threats, efforts at different levels, including state level, local level, community level, individual level, as well as international level, are not only needed but also have to work together in a concerted way. Any level is indispensable while it cannot go it alone. In the meantime, they cannot replace but are complementary to each other. For example, on state level, the central government has to develop national cyber strategies and policies, while local governments and the local thirds will have to implement and adapt them to local realities and report cyber incidents back to the central government and the national thirds. Similarly, efforts on individual, community, company, or group, and even international level are also very important. Third, multi-dimension. Multi-dimension refers to the fact that cyber security covers technical, political, economic, cultural, legal, criminal, and even military aspects, which require different measures to effectively cope with those diverse cyber threats. For example, to deal with various cyber vulnerabilities in real terms, technical expertise will always be of primary importance. In this aspect, national and regional thirds have performed well in addressing cyber threats through national efforts and international cooperation. Meanwhile, the technical community could set industry standards to regulate and facilitate the spread, development, and use of ICTs. To put it simply, without computer scientists or technology know-how, there will be no cybersecurity. In brief, to deal with the multifaceted cyber threats and vulnerabilities, multidimensional cyber efforts and actions have to be taken. Finally, some concluding remarks. There are some overlaps with the above three multis due to the very simple fact that every actor, level, and dimension not only occupies a unique position in global internet governance structure, but also enjoys multiple attributes and carries multiple functions, just like a man who could be a son, husband, and father simultaneously at home. And different scenarios, he will assume different roles. In this web of internet governance, states will occupy a central, leading, and coordinated role, as only a state has the authority, resources, and obligations to mobilize all social forces to build a safe and secure cyber environment. The state is also in a proper position to connect the local and the international, as well as to connect the policy and technical aspect of the internet governance. Of course, the state and the government is by no means almighty, as it could not do everything for others. Therefore, a division of labor among the different actors, levels, and dimensions is needed, with each of them taking on their own dual roles, thus greatly increasing the effectiveness and efficiency of internet governance. Moreover, this multi-model of global internet governance is also a way of international cooperation, as it tries to involve as many actors, levels, and dimensions as possible. In the process, all relevant parties' concerns are cared for, mutual trust being built, distrust and misunderstanding avoided, and international cyber conflict prevented. This multimodal is both innate and man-made. Innate because all participants, levels, and dimensions are just over there. You cannot neglect them. Man-made because we, the people, as well as the organizations and the states made of the people, have to import new impetus into this dynamic process. Last but not least, whatever the name, an effective mechanism of global internet governance should adapt to local realities, national conditions, as well as international concerns. to produce real and sound results. And as required by the Secretariat, I'd like to present very briefly about the best practices on cybersecurity in China. First, China sees Internet as a major opportunity for its reform, opening up, and modernization course. Second, China manages cyber affairs in line with law. Third, China promotes international and bilateral cooperation. Several of our colleagues just now already mentioned this point. And fourth, China combats cybercrime in line with law. Fifth, China addresses cyber incidents through international cooperation, especially through third. Sixth, China help build cyber capabilities and narrow digital gaps with developing countries. Finally, China endeavors to build a benign international environment for cyber affairs because cyberspace is not an isolated realm immune from the influence of the international relations from other fields. Therefore, China spends great efforts in developing good state-to-state relations in other fields, which is conducive to maintaining the peace and the stability of cyberspace. China also seldom publicizes or blames others for the cyber attacks it suffers, as mutual accusations are not the right way to solve cyber problems and combat cyber threats. The above is only a scholar's view. It does not represent the China Institute of International Studies or the MFA. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate your adhering to the schedule because we are running out of time. We have now our two discussants, our two lead discussants. Audrey, do you want to go first? And then thank you.
Thanks, Jim. And I just want to reinforce our thanks to the Republic of Korea for hosting this conference and for executing such a impressive attendee list and set of topics that we're covering. I'll be very brief because I know we want to try to get to the audience, but I want to thank the organizers for including the private sector in this panel and this discussion. They have in the past, and I think it's excellent that we are continuing that tradition going forward. So just a couple of thoughts with regard to international security and how we might proceed forward. First is that the primary role of the private sector here is predominantly to build and operate the global digital infrastructure. And for us, while national boundaries and geographies are extremely important, we're operating at a global scale, cross-border, and serving customers around the world. So for us, it's been concerning, deeply concerning to watch the escalation of conflict over the past few years. Because while we're focused primarily on innovation, research and development, and our main interest is in driving growth and prosperity, we recognize that peace and security and stability are fundamental to achieving those goals, which is something that has been recognized over and over the past day here. So I think it's helpful what my colleagues here have said about the progress that's been made the past year. The government group of experts report that recognizes officially that it's appropriate to define a role for the private sector and civil society in the discussions of norms going forward. Very encouraged to hear that there will be a continuation of the GGB process in 2014. But for the private sector, I think there's still ambiguity around how we engage, and it's an area of work and cooperation that we can further in the upcoming discussions and in bilateral, regional, and international fora that either already exist or may need to exist in the future to further the conversation. So just a couple of points about things that we think are important to advance. I think perhaps it goes without saying, since I'm sitting here, that broadly accepted norms, additional norms beyond perhaps what we've already discussed is necessary. I think many of the panelists have already mentioned that, and I know Jim wants to dive deeper into those possibilities. We're very encouraged by the recognition of the applicability of existing international law, and I think that there's deeper conversation that can get into more detail on some of the issues that are maybe unique to cyberspace, but that have analogies and precedent in other areas of history. I think it's important that companies and governments continue to structure themselves in a way that they can cooperate better together, so that they're just structured better to handle cyberspace issues, and that makes it easier for there to be a channel and a funnel for the private sector's views to be heard. And then, as several of my colleagues mentioned, the bridging the gap between technology and policy, and I think it's helpful. It's one of the areas where the private sector is potentially the most able to help in bridging that gap to the extent that it exists. And then I want to lastly mention, because it's been a huge focus at this conference, the importance of education and capacity building and advancing the norms discussion. I think that the two definitely go hand in hand, and it's an area where the private sector is certainly investing and should continue to invest in cooperation with governments and the public sector. So just in closing, it may be self-evident to everyone here that the commercial technology providers are most interested in cyberspace being used for prosperity and growth. And we recognize that conflict is perhaps a reality, and it's going to continue to exist, but de-escalation efforts are extremely important to the continued growth and innovation of the internet, to the viability of the private sector globally, to continue to drive innovation, to continue to drive the technologies that we know and love today and don't know yet in the future, but we know we want. So we encourage restraint, cross-border collaboration, continued dialogue, and we recognize that all of those are necessary to advance the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Last but not least.
Thank you. And there is a wide consensus among my colleagues here regarding the CBM, the contribution of CBM, relying on treaties, agreement, cooperation, norms, transparency, to the safer cyberspace. However, such regulation, which cannot be practically enforced and implemented, might be ineffective. It is similarly to formulating laws against physical violation without police force. Since cyberspace is very dynamic and deeply involves very evolving technology and threats which are new on a daily basis, such an enforcement is actually calling for challenging technological capabilities that might serve as an enabler to this enforcement. I would like to, with your permission, I would like to suggest an analogical paradigm to the cyberspace in the form of airspace. Actually, airspace deals with both commercial and military activities and interest. In order to ensure safe airspace operation, regulation has been formulated in the form of air traffic control, airways, etc. The accountable organs for the airspace are both the airliners, in our case, those are the service provider, and the countries, both countries in which the aircraft is originated and country through which the aircraft is flying. This is the proxy in our case. However, in order to avoid malicious violation of the airspace and the regulation, air situational technology has been developed and deployed. The picture, the air situation picture, is actually shared between countries and in the countries, and enabled to provide safe airspace operation. Similarly, when we are speaking about our domain, the cyberspace, the service provider must be regulated to harden and standardize their infrastructure in order to avoid, to eliminate proxies. It's something like locking the cockpit in commercial jets during flights. industry must develop the enabling technologies which allow deriving an holistic and meaningful cyber situation picture that will cover actually the whole space, including early warning, including insight that might alert on a forthcoming attack. This picture can be, in turn, be the basis for supporting the attribution challenge that was mentioned here, and enforcing accountability in cases of violation, both malicious and unintentional. The huge amount of data and transactions in the cyberspace and the constant change of protocols on a daily basis within this domain require the technology to be as automatic as possible, to be very adaptive, even up to the level of artificial intelligence. I believe that our role as an industry and our contribution for safe or safer cyberspace is deeply involved in developing those technologies that will be served as enabler for that purpose. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So here's what we're going to do since we're about out of time. First, we're going to run a little over. Two, I'm going to see if there's any one burning question, and I get to pick, from the audience. I have a question myself that I'm going to put to people. If you have, I see folks I know out there, I may call on you by name if we don't get anything. And then three, the Secretariat seems to want to have a couple statements at the end, and we'll do that, and then you can, you're dismissed and you can go to lunch. So this was a very rich discussion. It's something that I've got pages of notes from actually, but anyone in the audience have a question that they particularly want a question? No? Well, I have a question, and I'll just do one. We'll go down the row here, but one of the things that is a new development we haven't talked about is the convergence of cybersecurity, international security, whatever you want to call it, and internet governance, right? So this is a new field. Before we kept these things separate to a large account, and you had one community that did one, another community that did the other, and now they are merging. It's almost a gravitational force. So maybe what I could ask the panelists, starting with our Chinese colleague, Zhu, if he would be willing, what's the relationship between internet governance, cybersecurity, international security? And if we could do it quickly, because we have some wrap-up things at the end. Do you feel comfortable starting? I can start at this end if it's easier.
I think the internet governance is a way for promoting international cooperation. And so long as the international cooperation goes on, I think the mutual trust can be built between states, and thus finally promotes international security. Thank you.
That's great. And one thing to think about is, in the future remarks, I should have said this before, is if there are institutional changes that you think are essential. One of the issues that came up repeatedly in the GGE was the role of the UN, and I would say there is not consensus on that, although there are very strong views. So, John, maybe you want to address both.
A very good question, Jim. I guess coming back to my sort of first principles approach, if you disentangle the different strands, I think it's important to look at each strand separately. Say cybercrime, we have a lot of experience in dealing with international crime. Many of the traditional tools apply to cybercrime, but you need to add some additional elements because cyber is different. So I think it's important to deconflict. Internet governance, multi-stakeholder, business has to be involved. So you know, Australia is a great multilateralist. We support UN processes. We want inclusivity. But it seems to us the best way forward is to have the norms conversation in the UN GGE process, to take that forward. There are obviously conversations in other bits of the UN system, but I think you need to disaggregate, look at the particular dynamics, and then cross-reference again. This is the great challenge, I think, particularly for foreign ministries, because we have an overview of what we're doing internationally. A lot of our colleagues in our communications ministries, our interior ministries, do excellent work in different tracks of the multilateral system, but we don't always follow all of that. So I think it's disaggregation, looking at distinctive elements, looking at the reality of the internet, which is multi-stakeholder, but then looking at the cross-correlation. So it's quite a complex exercise. I think we're all wrestling with how to do this, certainly with tight budgets and busy staff. So, but I think there is a need to integrate this conversation and look across the different areas and make sure that when we talk about the issues, we do think about the wider implications, because things you do in defence and security have economic impacts. It's really important not to overlook the realities or get ourselves into a particular zone that's a track that's cut off. So perhaps that's not a helpful answer, but I think we do need to come at this with some conceptual rigour and think about the different dynamics and the different tracks, and then reintegrate the conversation.
Thanks, John. Andre.
Well, I think the key issues here is that we do not dispute the multi-stakeholder phenomena of internet, but all these multi-stakeholders should be guaranteed that internet would always be operational, stable, accessible, and secure. If it's guaranteed, if it does not depend on anybody's will who run it this way or another, then it's all accepted. There would be no political discussions. Let us guarantee these four phenomena, which were formulated during the Tunis WSIS conference, and then I think the issue will be solved.
Can I just do a quick follow-up, before Chris, and say, who would be the guarantor? Who would you have in mind as a guarantor?
Multi-stakeholders.
Okay, but in what format? In the UN, in ICANN, in a new institution?
Well, to think of this personally, I think that negotiations on this issue should be broadened, and this issue was discussed at G8 level. That all participants should take their own part according to their competence and contribute to the process. So the governments cannot do it alone, as well as business by itself. So it should be a joint action, as my colleagues already mentioned.
Great, thank you.
So all of these topics are interrelated. Indeed, in our international strategy now a couple of years ago, we said that you had to look at governance, you had to look at human rights online, you had to look at cybercrime, cybersecurity, and international security together. And I think you have to step back and say, well, what is your goal for cyberspace? And the goal that we laid out there, which I think is really the goal of everyone in the community, is an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable information and communications infrastructure around the world. So to guarantee that openness, you really need a multi-stakeholder system of governance where governments have a role to be sure, but the private sector and civil society have an important role and a really co-equal role. Governments are not calling the shots on that, and that's important for preserving the openness of the internet. It's important for preserving the interoperability of the internet, and it means that no one government or group of governments is calling all the shots. With respect to cybersecurity, that's very important for governments, again, working with other stakeholders to build those defenses, to make sure their networks are secure, and to cooperate internationally. Indeed, a lot of the capacity building that was discussed in the GGE report goes directly to that, what we call cybersecurity due diligence. And then finally, international security. Now, that's an area where, although other stakeholders like the private sector and others have a stake and are involved in the discussion, that's where governments can do some things to dial down the risk of conflict. You know, I've heard on this panel this discussion of militarization of cyberspace and a lot of countries developing cyber capabilities. That's just the reality of an advance of technology. But how do you address that? You address it by having the applicability of international law, which is meant to prevent conflict. It's meant, and if conflict happens, meant to have very important concepts like distinction and proportionality that really bound that conflict. And even the U.S. has a doctrine of restraint in this area from our presidential directive that it really is a doctrine of restraint. And yes, we might use military, as we said in our international strategy, but as a last resort, and you would use diplomatic, trade, and every other tool, just like every other country would do. So I think they do all hang together, and what I take from that is in the international security area, the most important thing we need to do is to really start expanding these practical measures, these confidence-building measures. I've heard that, we've been working in the OSCE now for some time, and the ARF is another great forum. These are ways to really multilateralize this, to have many countries involved. A bilateral example is an important example, but we really need to get other countries involved in this. And capacity building and cybersecurity due diligence help people be part of that discussion, but we need to do that.
Professor Lin, please.
I think to make our report more productive and effective, development of technology must be accompanied. So I think ITU will help. Thank you.
Thank you. I am going to ask our two discussants before I go back to the floor, but I will say it does seem to me that there's almost a consensus on some role to be defined for a multi-stakeholder, multi-actor approach. And one of the issues moving forward might be a better definition of what this multi-stakeholder model would look like. It seems to me there's less consensus on the military aspects of cybersecurity. And one of the issues I've seen repeatedly is it's difficult to have discussions if countries differ on whether or not they're actually engaging in military activities. It's difficult to talk about exchanging doctrine if people don't have doctrine or won't admit to having doctrine. So this could be another area of work, easier to see how to get progress on the multi-stakeholder side. With that, why don't I ask Anne and Audrey for final remarks before we go back to the floor, and then we'll finish on the issue of relationship between governance and security. Brief, if you could.
Okay, you mentioned the issue of cybersecurity with both defense or military and commercial purposes. And I believe that the effort at least, is in line because if you, and I mentioned before, if you'd like to provide or to defend your system, and it doesn't matter if your system are a weapon system or defense system or a private sector equipment, the same methodology should be actually implemented. You, as I mentioned before, should, because it is global, we're speaking about a global domain, very wide, there is no perimeters that are actually limiting the risk of cyber attacks. So the methodology is the same. You have to develop a cyber situational picture in order to be effective in your defense and protection on your system, whatever your system are.
Thanks. So broadly speaking, I would say think about this as security being an issue of trust, and the governance organizations that are broadly multi-stakeholder, broadly non-governmental, broadly private sector-led, as being inherently in need of trust in order to further their operations. So, it may be a bit self-evident over time that as the trust situation degrades or as conflict escalates, it implicates the governance of the infrastructure that we rely on. And so I think that's how we've seen the issues converge. And so I think if we approach the issue of rebuilding trust, confidence building measures, you'll see the conversations around governance develop in a similarly productive way, or at least we would be hopeful that that would be that progress in the area of international security, cybersecurity, building trust, developing those norms would help provide clarity, stability in the governance area and reinforce the existing multi-stakeholder models and the role of the private sector in managing that infrastructure.
Thank you, Audrey. Well, I want to apologize to the audience. I think we have just scratched the surface of this topic, and the lack of time, we had excellent speakers. It just wasn't possible to go into this in the depth that I would have liked, but I do think we covered an immense amount of ground. We heard some very new things. Why don't we quickly go down the row? Any final remarks from any of the panelists? This is your last chance. You stand between them and food. and then we'll have a couple questions from the floor, a couple remarks from the floor, but this is for you on the podium here. Go ahead, please, Zhu.
And with regard to the global internet governance, I think in policy fields, the United Nations is the best forum, best place for the states to discuss, to debate, and reach consensus, and to build trust. And on technical terms, I think ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, I think maybe is the right forum, the right place for future discussions and debates. Of course, within the framework of internet governance, there will be different aspects and different layers of players. I think by way of kind of participation, continuous participation for a long time, and some consensus can be built, and cybersecurity can be expected. So in the whole, I think the UN now has the legitimacy. ITU will have the authority. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? It's a shame old Hamadoun Touré wasn't here to hear all these plaudits, but no, are we? Chris, do you? Oh.
Well, a couple of things. You know, I do think there's been a valuable discussion. I do think there's a lot of work ahead, and I think there's a lot of practical work ahead. But I would also say that although I think the UNGG has been very successful, and indeed, if there is another one, I think that can build on that success as a crucible of countries talking about this. I do think that the role of the UN was substantially overstated by some on the panel. I think that the UN is a fine institution for many reasons, but it is an institution of governments. It's not an institution of other stakeholders, and that's indeed very difficult when you try to put topics like internet governance into a UN forum. It just doesn't work. It becomes states talking to states, which is important for some aspects of the cyber discussion, but certainly not all of them, and all of them are interrelated. So I think it's important to look at all the different institutions we have out there, the multi-stakeholder institutions, the regional forums where we're taking forward work on confidence-building measures, et cetera, to really get some practical progress. For instance, the ITU, again, has different levels of expertise. It deals more with the transport layer. We really, I think, need to just not fall back into these areas and really think about where we can engage all the countries in these discussions. And I think that there are ways to do that in a more multi-stakeholder way, especially when we're talking about governance. And again, what I'd like to see come out of this discussion, and what I think will come out anyway, is that we have a lot of practical work to do ahead, and these regional forums are good ways as crucibles to move that forward.
Thank you, Chris. At the request of the Secretariat, we have two organizations that would like to make brief statements before we conclude. So if I could ask ICT for Peace to begin. What?
Hello?
Oh.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and
thank you, Jim. In the interest of time, I will be very brief. We have prepared a statement, and we will give it to the conference. Just to say that a number of important and interested stakeholders from industry, civil society, technical community, academia and government met yesterday to discuss progress both on the field of norms and CBMs. And let me just share with you a few principles that were reiterated in that meeting, that when we discuss norms and CBMs in these processes, that they be underpinned by the principles of shared responsibility, responsible behavior, inclusion, collaboration, and transparency. As many of you also have welcomed, of course, that the UNGGE explicitly, and for the first time, I think, recognized the importance of drawing on civil society, industry, and academia. And I think it's now up to us to have a responsibility from academia, from business, from civil society, to pull together our opinions, our views, and make them available. In this context, I think it's very important that this process of engagement takes a wider range of geographic perspectives as it has been to date. I think several regions are not as active as others, and they have to bring into the fore and into the community and into the network. So we call on governments to draw on these insights. We, on our side, have the responsibility to pull together. And it was noted that ICT for Peace Foundation, of whom I am the chairman, will provide an initial focal point for establishing how this can be developed into a scalable and sustainable process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and copies of your statement will be made available later today. Jay, did you want to add the final brief remark?
I'm Jason Healy with the Atlantic Council. Thank you, Jim, and of course, again, to our Korean hosts. The Atlantic Council had a side breakfast this morning to discuss systemic cyber risk. As we've found, we've nearly always look at cyber risks organization by organization. With sponsorship from Zurich Insurance, we've been looking at how similar this is to how we tried and failed to mitigate financial risks prior to 2008. Then, even banks that balanced the risks well were still caught out, causing not just a bad quarter for some banks, but a few bad years for all of us. Accordingly, governments and companies cannot simply look at risk one organization at a time, but instead must give more focus to stability to cyberspace as a whole. The interdependence of cyberspace is at least as complex as that of finance, so cascading failures will affect even those with excellent cybersecurity. So resilience, in particular, will be increasingly important. Our report on cyber subprime will be out in the spring. Thank you.
Thanks, Jay. I'll make a concluding remark, which is Ambassador Krutsky and I share something that I don't think anyone in the room shares, which was he and I are the only two people who've worked on both the 2010 GGE, I worked for him, and the 2013 GGE, where he was an expert and played an invaluable role. I did my usual stuff, for better or for worse. And one thing you need to know, we've had the GGE held up here frequently today. It was not easy in either case, and in both cases, it went right down to the wire, right down to the last day, with a few countries holding out, demanding things. There was deep disagreement. A bit less disagreement in 2013, but these were never easy, and these came very close to failing, right? If you'd asked me on Thursday night of the last day of the last week of this GGE, I would not have taken a bet, right? So what we've heard today is some very positive remarks, some very deep insights, but we've also identified a number of areas that will dog future discussion. How does this fit in with internet governance? What is the role of the military? Is it an arms race? Is it something we need to control? And then finally, how do we accommodate the multi-stakeholder model that has guided the internet so far into a process where states now are asserting sovereignty in a way that we don't fully understand? So I look forward to the work of the 2014 GGE. I think it will make invaluable contributions if the trend can be continued. But let none of us take for granted that this will be an easy process or that we actually have deep consensus. We're on the right track, but we're a long way from the goal. So with that, thank you. You've been very kind in staying past your lunch hour. Let me ask if you'll join me in thanking our panelists for a truly fabulous job.
Thank you, Senior Fellow James Lewis, our speakers and discussants. This brings us to the end of panel discussion 5. Ladies and gentlemen, luncheon is now ready to be served at Conference Room South 307 and 308. From now until 13:40, you can enjoy your lunch and our staff will assist you with the directions. In addition, the ICT exhibition is on at Hall D2. Many of our cybersecurity and IT companies are participating in this exhibition, and you can experience the state-of-the-art ICT hardware and software as you enjoy your tour. After lunch, please return to your seats by 13:35 as the joint plenary with Youth Forum will begin at 13:40. Thank you.